Hello, everyone. In today lecture and readings, we are focusing on America, Iberia, and Africa before the conquest. So, basically, the intention and the goal with this session is just to establish a little bit of context on what was going on in what we call now the Americas, right? Europe and Africa before conquest, because conquest was precisely an encounter between these three regions of the world that were not connected before that. So our intention is to see that today, where who were the societies, living in what today is Latin America and the Caribbean before European conquest. What was happening in Iberia? That means like this European peninsula where Spain and Portugal are located, and Africa. What was happening in Africa at the moment of conquest? So I want you first to look at this map. As you can see, the map, I really like it. It's called The World According to Christopher Columbus, circa 1490. And it shows you what Christopher Columbus had in mind when he started this 1492 trip to the Americas and what he actually found, right? Remember, we are in a moment in history where it was not. Like it was not still not common knowledge the idea that we live in a round earth, right? Back then people actually tended to think we lived in a flat earth, but Columbus, what he was saying, you can see in this map, you can go from the Iberian Peninsula, and the Iberian Peninsula is right here. Let me see if you can see it. Right, it's right here. And he wanted to go all the way through the Atlantic, but what he wanted to go, like where he wanted to go, was to Japan, Asia, and India. It was a way to connect Spain, right, and Europe to the Asian markets. And why did he want to do that? Basically, because the Mediterranean Ocean that you can see right here was dominated by the Ottoman Empire. Right? The Ottoman Empire controlled most of that, and Europeans didn't, like, were not able, particularly Spanish and Portuguese, were not able to go to the Mediterranean Sea to have access here to the Indian and Asian markets. So what he wanted to do was to go across the Atlantic with the idea, right, that the Earth is actually round and we can go the other way around. And you can see here in the map what he didn't know was there, right, is the huge continent we now call the Americas. And it was this trip that initiated what we know as the conquest. So, what we want to see now is at the moment of this trip of Columbus, what was going on in these three regions of the world: the Americas, Europe, and Africa. So, let's start talking about the Americas first. You can see here a map of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, with some of the civilizations, indigenous civilizations you might have heard about before coming to class. You have the Aztec Empire, right, in what today is Mexico, the Mayas in Mexico and parts of Central America, the Muiscas, what today is Colombia, the Inca Empire, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, right? And you have all the Tupi-speaking indigenous peoples of the coast of what today is Brazil. So the first thing that you have to keep in mind when we discuss the indigenous societies of Latin America and the Caribbean before conquest is that they were all greatly different. It's still today, a huge continent with very different societies living in there. So that's the first thing we want to lay down to have the discussion about what was going on at the moment of conquest, is that we're able to find mostly three main groups of indigenous societies in what today is Latin America and the Caribbean. The first one is the group of nomadic groups of hunters and gatherers. When we talk about hunters and gatherers, it means people, this was very common in this area right here, which is the Amazon rainforest, people who are always on the move, right? Their food intake comes mostly from hunting and fishing, right? And gathering, right? The main thing that is missing here, right, is agriculture. It's not people who settle on the land and cultivate. It's people who are mostly moving. This makes sense in certain regions like the Amazon rainforest because of the conditions of the land. it's not easy to practice agriculture, particularly intensive agriculture. So that's our first group. Again, like an example of this is indigenous peoples in the Amazon rainforest. Then we have a second group, which is called semi-sedentary groups. And the main difference between this one and the last one is while the semi-sedentary groups also hunt and also gather, right? They also gather fruits, they also gather seeds. Um, in addition to that, the semi-sedentary groups practice something called rotative agriculture. This also happens in other areas of the Amazon rainforest and what used to be Atlantic rainforest in present-day Brazil. And basically what rotative agriculture means is that, let's say they start here in this point that I'm pointing out, right? They stay in this area for a couple of years, like 2, 5, 10 years, right? And then they move to another area. And in each of the points where they stop, they practice agriculture, but they don't stay in the same place. So it's an agriculture that is rotating through different parts of the land. The last example of indigenous society that we can find before conquest is what we call sedentary population, dense and urban. Okay, examples of this is mostly the Inca Empire, the Mayas, and the Aztec Empire. And the big difference here is that they always stay in the same place. They don't only practice agriculture, as the semi-sedentary groups did, they also stay in the same place. And because they stay in the same place, they have the ability to grow and create big cities, right? The capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, at the moment of conquest was one of the largest cities in the world. The capital of the Inca Empire, Cusco, was also really, really big, even when compared with European cities, right? And this difference is very important because conquest is going to happen very differently to all of these groups. When as we are going to see in the next session, when we talk about the age of conquest, we're talking mostly about the conquest of these big, then sedentary populations, mostly the Incas and the Aztecs. Right? But the conquest of semi-sedentary groups and nomadic groups is going to prove more difficult for the European conquistadors. So let's just very fast talk about three of the groups that are more like the most important when we discuss conquest. The Mayas, right? You can see here one pyramid that like is very famous in the case of the Mayas, called Chichen Itza, is located today in Mexico near Cancun, right? Cancun, Tulum, like all these places you have very likely heard before. Like all of their names come from Maya words, actually in the Maya language. So the Mayas still live, right? That's the other part. They still live in their what used to be their ancestral homes, and what today is Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, southern Mexico, mostly the Yucatan Peninsula. And they were very important for their contributions to astronomy, mathematics, and writing. They had a writing system, right? They have very complex and advanced astronomical knowledge. Like this pyramid that you're seeing here, Chichen Itza, actually used to be a calendar, and you know which day of the year you are because of the shadow that it creates when the sunlight hits it. But they didn't have a unified political structure. They were not an empire. They were a constellation of what we call city-states. So basically, each Maya city was its own thing. And this is important when we talk about conquest because the Spaniards are going to have to find a great difficulty conquering the Mayas because it's not like you conquer the capital and then because you have control over the capital, you control the entire Mayan society. No, you have to go over every single one of them. The Aztecs and their capital city Tenochtitlan that you can find portrait in this painting. They lived mostly in what we call the Valley of Mexico, what's today Mexico City. Their capital was Tenochtitlan, but there were like other cities very near, such as Texcoco and Tlacopan. And like this urban conglomerate had over 1.5 million people, right, by the early 15th century. So again, it was one of the largest urban areas in the world. And it was a very powerful and extensive empire. So In contrast to the Mayas that were decentralized, in the case of the Aztecs, you're going to find, right, when you look into this with more detail, a centralized empire. So when you have a centralized empire, it's easy, like the conquest is easier because what you have to do is just to take the top, to take the capital, and then just have control of everything under that structure. And very similar is going to be the case of the Incas. They were, as I showed you in the map, mostly on the Pacific coast of South America, what today is Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Chile. Their capital was Cusco, the city of Cusco. It still exists in Peru. It has like very old architecture, roads, and other kind of constructions that were built by the Incas. You can go and see them today. And even though Cusco is not the capital of Peru anymore, like the capital of Peru is now Lima, that was founded by the Spaniards shortly after conquest, Cusco is still um, one of the largest and most important cities in South America and in Peru in particular. The Inca Empire is also very well known because it developed a very sophisticated political and administrative structure in the Americas. Basically, what they do is like because these are empires, and this is very important to keep in mind when we talk about the Aztecs and when we talk about the Incas, what we mean when we say they were empires is that they were conquering also other populations nearby. So at the moment of conquest, the Incas had control over other indigenous societies. The Aztecs had control over other indigenous societies. And in the case of the Incas, the way they did that was through the construction of roads, right? Like road building and the use of roads for administrative purposes is going to be one of the most important characteristic of the Inca Empire. And that's why so many archaeologists and historians compare the Incas to the Roman Empire. Roman Empire, a bit earlier, of course, than the development of the Inca Empire, also built many, many roads from the city of Rome, when they were based, and like through all the extension of the Roman Empire. And just as in the case of the Aztecs, the Incas were a very centralized empire, right? Concentrated on the figure of an emperor who had control over the entire political and economic system. And again, this is going to be a very important fact to keep in mind to analyze conquest next session. So now let's see what was going on in the Iberian Peninsula. Again, when we say Iberian Peninsula, um, we're talking about this part of Europe. You can see it right here, right? Like right here, like down East Africa, and then you have here the Atlantic Ocean, and that's pretty much present day Spain and Portugal. So the most important thing to keep in mind first when we talk about the Iberian Peninsula is that Spain as a country didn't exist at the moment of conquest. There wasn't a single political entity called Spain. That's like a development that is going to happen in the following decades and even centuries. What you're going to find at this moment is different kingdoms, right? The kingdom of Portugal, the kingdom of Castile, the kingdom of Andalusia, of Aragon, right? Like all of these places, Navarre, also here up in the north, near the border with France. So it's a very not yet unified and kind of diverse peninsula, right? And even if you go today to Spain, like in Latin America, we speak Spanish, right? Espanol. But what we actually speak is Castilian, the one that comes from Castile. But if you go, for instance, to the south, to what today is Catalonia, particularly to Barcelona, the capital city, people will understand you in Spanish, of course, but most of the people are actually going to speak Catalan, right? Similar to Spanish, similar to French, but still a different language. If you go, for instance, to Galicia, right? In Galicia, they're going to speak also a very different language, similar to Spanish, but not the same. If you go to the Basque country, also in the north, well, this one is actually very, very different from Spanish. And as even as of today, like this cultural difference remain within what is the country of Spain. So the most important historical event that happens in the Iberian Peninsula before conquest is the Reconquista, the reconquest. So what does this mean? The south of what today is Spain, right? All of these around here, Córdoba, Sevilla, Andalusia, Granada, for more than 800 years, it was dominated by Islamic polities. Basically, after the expansion of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula all the way to North Africa, they crossed, like you can see, like here, how close North Africa is to Europe, particularly to Spain. So they crossed and they conquered the southern part of what today is Spain, right? Um, for almost a little bit more of 800 years. And you're going to have very multicultural experiences here, where you have Jewish population, Muslim population, Catholic population living under Islamic rule. So the Reconquest is basically when two of these kingdoms, particularly Castile and Aragon, the most powerful ones, they moved against all of these part of the Iberian Peninsula dominated by these Islamic polities, and they kicked them out of what today is Spain. Right? So they call it a reconquest because there was an idea like this is our, like our Spain, Hispania, like it's a very long name coming from Roman times, but it was not truly ever theirs, right? It was the home of like a very diverse population under Islamic rule, but that's going to change. And this reconquest is very important because it happens just a couple of years before the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the Americas, and the dynamics of these two kingdoms that I was mentioning, Castile and Aragon, the way in which they engage with the south part of the Iberian Peninsula to reconquer it from, or like to take over from, like the region from these Islamic rulers, like the dynamics of this reconquest and then going to be applied for the conquest of the Americas. And there are like a lot of similarities that we're going to see later. And the second issue that I wanted to mention about the Iberian Peninsula, particularly Spain and Portugal, is that they became very important in the global economy, in the global world, during conquest and after conquest. Like they were able actually to expand all the way through the Atlantic to reach what today we call the Americas, because they sponsor overseas exploration. Okay, they were really good navigators. That's very important to keep in mind. While the Spaniards were the first one to make the Atlantic crossing, and they arrived in the Caribbean, in an island of what today is the Bahamas with Christopher Columbus, the Portuguese went around Africa and all the way to India and China, right? They were the first to establish this connection with the Asian markets through navigation, right? Instead, you have the Silk Road, for instance, that went also all the way to China, but it was ground transportation, which took like very, very long. But with just going down like all the off the coast of Africa and around Africa and then around India, like Arabian Peninsula and then around India and China, that's the way that the Portuguese found. And during the first, like almost entire 15th century, actually, the Portuguese Empire is going to focus mostly on their Asian colonies, while the Spanish are going to focus on their colonies in the Americas. And then we have our third continent in this discussion. Remember, right? Like the conquest is this encounter between America, Africa, and Europe. So we talk about America, we talk about Europe, particularly the Iberian Peninsula. So three important facts about Africa. The first one is that it was and it remains today a very diverse continent. Um, Hundreds of ethnic groups uh, that lived in this land for thousands of years. So it's not an unified continent. We say Africa as the same, but we say Latin America, we say Europe. Like these like conceptions of these continents tend to group together, right? Societies that actually among them tend to be very, very different. And in terms of the conquest and the following development of the colonial society in Latin America and the Caribbean under European colonial rule, the most important part of this African society that's going to be imprinted in the Americas is through enslavement, right? By the 14th century and 15th century, by the 15th century, when Columbus first moved to the Americas, slavery was already an established institution in Africa, right? Mostly through the capturing of war captives, right? There were when you have like wars, basically the one that you know that is the winner after the war is going to enslave all the people that were vanquished by them. This dynamic is going to change over years, but and we're going to see how this change and transform into the Atlantic slave trade. But for now, just keep in mind that it was already an established institution in Africa by the moment of conquest of the Americas. And lastly, that most of Africa remained outside of European control until the 19th century. So all of these years, a colonial rule lasted in Latin America from the 15th century to the 18th century. Actually, African countries, what today are these African countries, they were largely independent from European rule. The conquest and colonization of Africa is only going to begin at the end of the 19th century. And it's going to be a rather short because you have decolonization of wars of independence already in the 20th century. And the last thing I want to mention before we move to the discussion of conquest, which is the topic of our next session, is the island of Hispaniola. Hispaniola is basically what today is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. It was not the first place where the Spaniards arrived. You can see in this picture Christopher Columbus, right? He first arrived in the Bahamas, in one of the many islands that compose today the Bahamas. But Hispaniola was the first island where the Spanish conquistadors settled, right? It was the first colonial experience as such between 1492 and 1519. 1519 is when the Spaniards leave the Caribbean. We're going to see this in the next session. They leave the Caribbean and they now go to what today is Mexico, right? But this period of like roughly 30 years, almost 30 years, is going to be the first colonial experience. And like this first colonial experience is going to tell us a lot about what's going to happen next. It's a period of experimentation, right? They get to know the indigenous population, they get to learn their language, get to learn the geography, um, and also capital accumulation, right? The spoils of war start flowing in the hands of the Spaniards. Like they're looking for gold, they're looking for silver, they enslave indigenous peoples, so as to, like amass a big amount of wealth that is going to be really important for the second part of this, which is the age of conquest. We can see already the destruction of indigenous societies and the demographic collapse of the indigenous population. All of these islands of the Caribbean um, were inhabited by very different indigenous societies. For instance, the Taínos in Dominican Republic, also Puerto Rico and other areas. And they were basically all wiped out through diseases, through warfare, through slavery. And in Hispaniola, we're going to see some of the institutions that set the foundations of colonial society, how the trade with Spain works, the use of indigenous labor, bringing European crops such as sugar, very important, and establishment of religious institutions, right? So it's this first moment of conquest is actually in the island of Hispaniola that the Spaniards hear from the local indigenous population that there is an empire across the sea, which is the Aztec Empire, very powerful, and they go there. Like the conquest is basically following rumors of wealth, and that's what they are doing. And they cannot do that if not for the experience of Hispaniola. I know 1492 to 1519, less than 30 years, might look like a very short period of time, but it was almost more than half, actually, more than half of like a general man's life back then. Like we have to keep in mind life expectancy was way shorter in the 15th century than it is today, and people would be expected to live 40 or 50 years. So it was almost an entire generation of Spanish settlers who were living in Hispaniola and getting to know the region, preparing for conquest. Okay, so with this, we close the discussion of what was going on before conquest, and with our next session, we will discuss conquest as such.